Book of Mormon saga was played out in western New York during a time primeval forests and ancient waters filled much of the land. In fact, without discovering the ancient landscape, the lands of the Book of Mormon may have continued to elude us. After studying various Book of Mormon geographical settings, Wikipedia reported, the text of the Book of Mormon is often viewed by scholars as favoring a limited setting of just a few hundred miles for most events. After studying various topography and sedimentation maps of the area at various times through history, this is a close representation of western New York shortly after the close of the Ice Age, when numerous bodies of water and forest filled the land. This is the same area featuring the individual lands and cities of the Book of Mormon, which, after careful attention to the geographical descriptions provided in the Book of Mormon, took several years to complete. Both maps will be used at times in this video as various landmarks are discussed or where their entire setting is needed to make the storyline flow better. The River Sidon in this setting matches in every way western New York's Buffalo River, with its shipping port as busy a place in ancient times as it is today. Alma tells us that Zarahemla itself was located along the River Sidon. As we move along, we will discover that the greater land of Zarahemla takes in much more territory than the local lands around the city of Zarahemla, an area bordered on both the east and the west by seas, with Lake Erie being the West Sea and a glacial lake left ponded in the Tonawanda Creek Valley being the seashore noted along its eastern borders. While much less water flows through the creek bed today, geologists tell us that a long finger-like lake once existed in Tonawanda Creek, which flowed north along a deep valley which began near the head of the River Sidon and then spilled out over the surrounding landscape further north, creating beaches all along the way before plunging over an escarpment and into ancient Lake Tonawanda. The limestone ledge of the Onondaga Escarpment created a step down to the flat plains below. Lake Tonawanda itself, which existed until about 1,000 years ago, was simply a northern extension of Lake Erie and the Niagara River, which spilled out across the northern plains for 58 miles, with its deeper western basin thus also referred to as the West Sea by the Nephites, notwithstanding this one was exclusive to the land northward. Reference to the West Sea South in Alma 53 and 8 may well have been an attempt to distinguish between the two bodies of water. The creek followed the north-sloping landscape throughout its journey from its headwaters at 1,300 feet to the flat plains further north at 650 feet, which is important to know as we go along, for those moving north in the Book of Mormon are always described as traveling down, while those moving south are always described as traveling up to their intended destinations. Just like Lake Erie was referred to as the West Sea rather than the West Lake, Book of Mormon scribes referred to all the various lakes in the region seas, just like the lake called the Sea of Galilee was back in the lands of their fathers. You might have noticed as you studied the Book of Mormon that none of the seas mentioned are capitalized, likely to avoid confusion, for the land was simply covered with lakes, ponds, and swamps anciently, and thus they were simply referred to as being either east or west of the local land under discussion at the time. Behold, it came to pass that Lamanites had come into the land of Moroni, which was on the borders by the seashore. And it came to pass that Amalickiah took possession of the city, yea, possession of all their fortifications. And those who fled out of the city of Moroni came to the city of Nephi. And it came to pass that he, meaning Teancum, headed Amalickiah as he was marching forth with his numerous armies, that he might take possession of the land Bountiful and also the land northward. But behold, he met with a disappointment by being repulsed by Teancum and his men. And it came to pass that Teancum and his men did pitch their tents in the borders of the land Bountiful, and Amalickiah did pitch his tents in the borders on the beach by the seashore, and after this manner were they driven. And it came to pass that when the night had come, Teancum and his servants stole forth and went out by night and stole privately into the tent of the king, and put a javelin to his heart, and he did cause the death of the king immediately. Moroni had thus gained a victory over one of the greatest of the armies of the Lamanites, and had obtained possession of the city of Mulek, which was one of the strongest holds of the Lamanites in the land of Nephi, and thus he had also built a stronghold to retain his prisoners. Having secured the southernmost city along the eastern borders, Moroni also sent orders that he should fortify the land Bountiful and secure the narrow pass which led into the land northward, lest the Lamanites should obtain that point and should have power to harass them on every side. One could see how easy it would have been for his army to hit them by the narrow pass which led by the sea into the land northward, yea, by the sea on the west and on the east. The small neck of land Alma mentions between the land northward and southward can be none other than the Batavia moraine, which extended right through the lake bed and into the lands further north. Alma describes it as a narrow neck of land in Alma 63 when describing Hagod's voyage northward. After yielding up the lands they had taken from the Nephites, having been converted by wondrous heavenly manifestations and told to repent, many of the converted Lamanites also began to move north, as did Lehi and Nephi, to preach to the people there. It's quite likely that the Lord led these righteous Lamanites eastward clear to Onondaga Lake, which was named after 3 holy men by that name. Onondaga Lake ultimately became the capital of the entire Iroquois government, with the Onondaga people putting forth a form of democratic government that was used as a base for our own U.S. Constitution. Now, while the cities in the northeast quarter of the land are rather remote, the city of Manti, which is one of the more prominent cities in the Book of Mormon, is always spoken of as being by the head of the river Sidon, very near the line that separated the Nephites and Lamanites, a line that we can now identify with Cattargus Creek, which was once filled with much more water than it is today. One of the first places the restored gospel of Jesus Christ was preached to the Lamanites was at the Cattargus Creek Reservation, where the Seneca branch of the Lamanites have now lived for centuries. The land of Nephi itself is described as bordering an east and west sea of its own. The Genesee River flows north all the way to Lake Ontario. A huge glacial lake was once left ponded on the broad plains in the south, which, when it broke through its ice barrier, plunged north through a narrow canyon with such force that it carved out the great Letchworth Gorge. Yet enough water remained in the lake to be a perfect fit for the sea bordering the land of Nephi on the east. Alma tells us, and the land of Nephi did run in a straight course from the east sea to the west. In studying out the archaeological record of the region, we find that most activity in the land of Nephi took place along the lowlands bordering Lake Erie, chiefly because it was lower in elevation and thus warmer and better for agriculture, especially fruit, including grapes, which is another interesting tie to the Book of Mormon, for wicked King Noah was said to have planted vineyards while the Nephites were living in the land of Nephi. And it came to pass that he planted vineyards round about in the land, and he built wine presses and made wine in abundance, and therefore he became a wine bibber, and also his people. While the more idle Lamanites settled along the coast, a large number of their cities were also built around the shores of Chautauqua Lake. Nephite cities appear to have been built further north along the beautiful Cassadaga Creek Valley. The entire valley was underlined by a great aquifer of clear spring water with a watershed of 140 miles. In fact, the Seneca name for Cassadaga is water under the rocks. We might remember that after hearing the words of the prophet Abinadi, Alma was converted to the Lord, and then went about preaching the gospel himself and baptizing his converts in a fountain of pure water adjacent a beautiful forest, just like the Leolin Woods, a small wooded area along the 3 connected Cassadaga Lakes, which has become a spiritual mecca today for those searching for the light. Now there was in Mormon a fountain of pure water, and Alma resorted thither, there being near the water a thicket of small trees, where he did hide himself in the daytime from the searches of the king. And after this manner he did baptize every one that went forth to the place of Mormon, and they were baptized in the waters of Mormon, and were filled with the grace of God. Now while the more part of the Nephites and Lamanites lived in cities and towns, the more idle Lamanites chose to live in the forest bordering the West Sea. For Alma tells us, now the more idle part of the Lamanites lived in the wilderness, and they were spread through the wilderness on the west in the land of Nephi, yea, and also on the west of the land of Zarahemla in the borders by the seashore, and on the west in the land of Nephi in the place of their fathers' first inheritance, and thus bordering along by the seashore. And also there were many Lamanites on the east by the seashore, whither the Nephites had driven them, and thus were the Nephites nearly surrounded by the Lamanites. Nevertheless, the Nephites had taken possession of all the northern parts of the land, bordering on the wilderness at the head of the river Sidon from the east to the west, round about on the wilderness side on the north, even until they came to the land which they called Bountiful. And it came to pass that the Nephites had inhabited the land Bountiful even from the east unto the west sea. And thus the Nephites in their wisdom, with their guards and their armies, had hemmed in the Lamanites on the south, that thereby they should have no more possession on the north, that they might not overrun the land northward. And it bordered upon the land which they called Desolation, it being so far northward that it came into the land which had been peopled and been destroyed, of whose bones we have spoken, which was discovered by the people of Zarahemla, it being the place of their first landing. Not surprisingly, archaeologists found evidence that a company of people arrived in western New York out of nowhere around 600 BC, a people with a round skull type typical of the Mulekites' Jewish ancestries, who fled Jerusalem around that very time in history. In fact, it's not improbable that it was the Mulekites who built the city of Mulek and named it after Mulek before moving north up the Buffalo River, a river they subsequently called Sidon, and settled what came to be known as Zarahemla after the people who first brought Prince Mulek to the land. And now no part of the land was desolate, save it were for timber, but because of the greatness of the destruction of the people who had before inhabited the land, it was called desolate. The story of the Jaredites can be found on my video entitled Niagara's Cemetery of Giants. Called of God to do so, Moroni recorded the history of both the Nephite and Jaredite nations on golden plates, and then hid them up in the hill Cumorah for those of our day, records which contained a powerful witness of Jesus Christ's ministry among the Nephites after his death and resurrection, and the life and times of two mighty nations who forgot the God of their fathers and were thus ultimately destroyed.